I have a real treat of a guest today. Dr. James DiNicolantonio, and yes, that is a mouthful to say, his last name, but he is a wealth of knowledge. He really brought so much information to the table and disputed a lot of misinformation with science-backed research. I'm going to read you his bio here because there's so much that I think you should know about Dr. James, like the fact that he is a doctor of pharmacy and was a cardiovascular research scientist at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute for over a decade. As well-respected and internationally known scientist and an expert on health and nutrition, he has contributed extensively to health policy. He serves as the associate editor of the British medical journal's Open Heart, a journal published in partnership with the British Cardiovascular Society, and is on the editorial advisory boards of several other medical journals. Dr. DiNicolantonio is the author or co-author of over 300 publications in medical literature. He is also the author of 9 best-selling health books. The Salt Fix, which is the one that I read, which really got me interested in Dr. James's work. But I will continue reading as I'm seeing these books here: The Super Fuel, The Longevity Solution, The Immunity Fix, The Mineral Fix, Win, The Obesity Fix, The Collagen Cure, and The Blood Sugar Fix. I think those are all great recommendations. And if they're anything like the Salt Fix, there's going to be a lot of information in there for you guys to learn, but so will there be in the podcast. Also, thank you so much for listening. And if you want to follow Dr. James on any of his platforms, you can follow him on Instagram and Twitter, or should I say X now, at Dr. James DiNic. That's DINIC. And on Facebook at Dr. James DiNicolantonio. Dr. James, it is my pleasure to have you on the show today. I read your book, The Salt Fix, and it really blew my mind. And I'll tell you why. Because as a professional athlete, for so long, I used salt in the wrong way. You're probably going to think this is like some horror story or something, because from your perspective, you know how important salt is. But I, as an athlete, this is almost embarrassing to admit, it's like the blind leading the blind. This is what I was told, and this is what we would do for so long. We would cut weight by eliminating all of the salt out of our bodies days before we would try to essentially dehydrate ourselves and get on the scale. So we would even drink like distilled water, no salt whatsoever, take it all off of our food and completely flush our bodies of any sodium, which now I know can be extremely dangerous when you're talking about hypernatremia, right? And not having any of the salt. And basically my body just wouldn't even sweat then at that point. And when I read The Salt Fix, I knew that I was doing a lot of the things correct. But I also felt like this is so eye-opening in the sense that salt's been demonized in so many ways, not just as athletes, not just as us thinking that it holds on to water, but a lot of people still think that salt is the devil. You know, I hear people like, oh, I had a high sodium diet. My fingers are tight and I'm swollen and I'm bloated. And I'm like, no, I actually think that was the sugar and the carbs. It's when people eat the cake at the party that they all get thirsty. Next time you go to a birthday party, wait till everybody eats a cupcake. That's when they get thirsty, not when they had the burger, not when they had, the things with salt in it. So anyways, I just wanted to give you a little bit of my learning experience and also my interest in really diving into salt, why it became demonized and why the other little white crystal, as you so described it, sugar kind of got the free pass along with the time, right, when fat was being demonized. So I'm going to give you the floor to kind of begin with that however you may.
Yeah, I mean, the demonization really started with a guy named Louis Dahl. He actually genetically bred these like salt sensitive rats because he wasn't able to actually induce high blood pressure in normal rats, giving them, significantly large quantities of salt. So he actually had to like breed salt sensitive rats in order to even do that. But he was one of the main proponents back in the day, recommending low salt diets. There was also someone named Walter Kempner who put people on what's called the rice diet. And so there was like very low protein, high carb, low salt, but it was a multi-interventional type of approach. And it wasn't a randomized study. It was more anecdotal, but he got a lot of press. And basically all of our dietary guidelines come from opinion. Back in 1977, the dietary goals came out for all Americans. There was 6 recommendations: low cholesterol, eat low saturated fat, eat a low total amount of total fat, but also eat a low amount of sodium. And we didn't even establish the Cochrane collaboration until 1993, which is the main group that does all the meta-analyses and looks at all the studies to give us actually good advice on nutrition. So really, we started 20 years before we even had, good evidence to recommend low salt, to recommend it. And essentially, we basically took a subset of people with high blood pressure, where only half of them are actually even salt sensitive. And we extrapolated those potential benefits to the general population. But when you do that, there's a problem. 80% of people with normal blood pressure are not salt sensitive. 70% of people with prehypertension are not salt sensitive. So you're kind of maybe helping a small subset of people, but potentially harming a majority of people, because there's so many harms that occur when you cut your salt intake, like high aldosterone, high renin, your heart rate increases, sleep actually worsens when you're on a low salt diet, many other factors. Insulin resistance increases for many
What is
reasons.
the what did you say, aldosterone? What is that?
Yeah. Aldosterone is a specific hormone that is increased to actually allow the kidneys to reabsorb more salt. But it can have like artery stiffening effects if it's chronically elevated. Same thing with renin and angiotensin 2. These are just hormones that are trying to hold on it and conserve sodium, but in the same time, they can have kind of these artery stiffening type of effects.
What? So, how is sleep affected? I think that is a really interesting topic. I am a great sleeper. I wear an Aura ring. Do you wear one? Do you have an Aura ring? Do you measure your sleep at all?
I've worn it like once, but no, I don't track my sleep.
Okay,
No.
so I'm a great sleeper. I think I'm a better sleeper than I used to be, but that's just, my opinion. But according to this, I'm like getting crowns all the time, 95% sleep, but I don't shy away from sodium at all. Now, I'm sure it's not just one thing that makes me a great sleeper. I think I manage stress well. I think I work out. I think I eat healthy. I do a lot of things probably that help me with sleep. But what is it about a low sodium diet that would potentially affect people's sleep, like cramping, leg cramps, restless leg syndrome?
That potentially could be one factor. It was a clinical study where they they put people on a low salt diet, and it significantly disrupted their sleep because it activated the sympathetic nervous system. So noradrenaline and adrenaline both increase. And so your heart rate increases. So sympathetic is kind of like the fight or flight type of system. And so, it is that type of response when you are cutting your salt intake, that your body views that as a stressful state. And so it activates, the sympathetic nervous system, which will drive up heart rate and can disrupt your sleep.
Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. So, how many, like, people are being recommended? People oftentimes think that sodium is so bad, but I guess could you help me distinguish between sodium, chloride, and minerals and how it actually works together? Because I do still feel like there's a bit of confusion even on my part of when I'm talking about salt, I'm not talking about table salt. Although I do feel like that is the salt that's put in, so like a lot of fast food. I mean, there have to be people who consume too much of that kind of salt. So how are we distinguishing what a good salt is and what just a not necessary to have too much of salt? Am I making sense with that? Did I compute that all right?
Yeah, I think so. There are higher quality salts, right? Like I use Redmond real salt. That's a higher quality salt. It has, more iodine in it. It has natural iodine. They don't artificially add potassium iodide. So on the label, the FDA makes them say like not a good source of iodide. That's because they don't artificially add it. It's just naturally contained in it. But it has like 60 trace minerals, not in huge, tremendous quantities, but it's unrefined. It's not bleached. It's not processed at high temperatures. The thing is, though, is that if you are low on salt, table salt will still give you benefits, right? Like if you're
Okay.
low on it. So, like basically, our body needs a set amount of sodium, typically around 400 milligrams at a minimum, where we're not like actually going negative sodium balance. But if you're someone who exercises, you can actually need up to 5,000 milligrams of sodium per day just to remain in positive balance. So it really depends on how much you sweat. But most guidelines recommend less than a teaspoon of salt, which is less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So salt is composed of sodium and chloride on a 1-to-1 ratio, but the weight is 60% chloride, 40% sodium. And so all guidelines tell us consume less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium. But you can lose 1,200 milligrams of sodium on average per hour of exercise. And you can go above 2,300 milligrams of sodium loss per hour if you're exercising in the heat. So it doesn't really apply to anyone who sweats like in any type of significant way, because you just simply lose too much salt through sweat. And what the guidelines don't realize actually as well is that coffee and caffeine is a tremendous salt waster. And I don't think they actually realize this, but for every 4 cups of coffee you consume, you lose a half a teaspoon of salt extra out in the urine. And so when you start adding these things up, you can lose well over a full teaspoon of salt, even though they're telling you that's the maximum you should be consuming per day.
Wow. So I had an experience. I mean, the coffee thing blows my mind. I'm not a coffee drinker, but I think a lot of people are going to be like, wait a minute. So I do recommend, though, based on your book, for people to, I'm not a doctor, obviously, please, this is not medical advice, but my friends and myself, if I were going to consume something with caffeine, which is very rare for me, sometimes I drink tea, but I always get salt in the morning, first thing in the morning with some water. That is one of my morning rituals. Usually just put a pinch of salt in my water, but if for any reason I was feeling like if I had a headache, if I have my eyes are dry, if I'm feeling like I need more hydration, then I will consume more salt. But I would probably be safe to say that it could be beneficial for coffee drinkers to get the salt in before they consume their coffee.
Yeah, the best thing you can do in the morning actually is to consume salt and electrolytes and water first thing, because you've just gone 8 hours not consuming any water or electrolytes typically. And what people don't realize too is caffeine and coffee actually reduce the absorption of electrolytes, salt, and water. So if you consume coffee, you are now decreasing your absorption of electrolytes and water by about 20%. So that's why it's best to probably hydrate with your salt, your fluids 30 minutes prior to any type of caffeine or coffee so that you fully absorb it. Whereas if you have coffee right away, you're going to reduce the absorption of the fluids and the electrolytes by about 20%.
That's really interesting. I'm definitely going to pass that along to my family and my fiance as well, because they are big coffee drinkers. I had a story where I was doing a crazy intense workout. I was dropping to 125 pounds, which is a weight class lower than me. And it was hot because I live in Las Vegas. So my fight was in July, and this probably was just a few weeks prior. And I remember after, I was consuming a lot of electrolytes while I was working out. I had access to that, but I was just sweating so much and I was working so hard for an hour plus. And I was on the treadmill for like the last 10 minutes and I just kept almost falling asleep during the running part. And drifting almost off the treadmill, and then also feeling extremely emotional, like I was gonna cry, but it was this odd feeling. I almost felt a bit euphoric. Like, how can I be like sleepy? Like if I could lay my head on a pillow and run right now, I'm pretty sure I would sleep and run at the same time. And then my body just shut down. I literally just cramped up into a ball, and my trainer had to catch me. And I think I was coherent, but my body wouldn't move. Like I was just cramped up, and he carried me into the house and began giving me a lot of salt and electrolytes and watermelon and putting everything back in. But I think that was probably an extreme example, right, of somebody pushing themselves to a point of sodium deprivation. How do we find that balance of intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid? Because I know that there have been times when intracellularly I have not been very hydrated, and I feel the effects of that. I actually don't, I can tell I don't feel hydrated. And I've even had IVs administered after weigh-ins These are common things that fighters used to do anyways, back when it was legal to do that. And I feel like it went extracellular and I felt really sluggish. I think I only did it once or twice, 2 times, I think, because the first time I thought it was a coincidence. But the IV fluids, at least in the shorter amount of time that we have to hydrate, didn't feel like they actually made me feel better. They did take my thirst away, but I did not feel better for it the next day competing when having had an IV after severe dehydration. So I don't know if that applies or if there's anything you have to say about that, but I was kind of wondering about the extracellular and intracellular hydration and how we make sure that those two are balanced well.
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you undershoot and you have too low of sodium, you are going to push too much water into the cell. Whereas if you have too high of sodium, you are going to pull water from the cell. And actually, what happens like with like if you overconsume alcohol, you pee out a lot of free water. So your sodium levels go high and that pulls water then out of the brain cells to try to lower the sodium level. And that's what gives you an actual like headache after you've like consumed too much alcohol. Like the next day when you have, you're feeling bad, it's actually due to that intracellular water depletion and the shrinkage of the brain cells from that. So how do you kind of like figure that out? I mean, thirst for water and thirst for salt will kind of help you. So you'll either, have a huge craving for salt if you've had fluids that doesn't have enough salt typically, or if you've had too much salt and not enough water, typically your thirst for water will kick in. So a lot of times it's just kind of following your own cravings for both salt or for hydration with water that can kind of help rebalance that.
Do IVs have a good management of these ratios, or is it mostly just sodium?
Well, it depends on the IV. I don't know exactly what type of saline solution you got. It could have been half normal saline, which is, not as salty as your blood, or it could have been normal saline. It just kind of depends. I'm not sure if you know what saline they gave you.
No, I don't. But I guess I'm wondering if a saline IV is going to have magnesium and potassium in that also.
Typically, if they're just giving saline, no, it will not. But at the same time, you don't really lose much magnesium or potassium through sweat. You only lose about 150 milligrams of potassium per liter of sweat, which is about per hour of exercise. And you're only going to lose about 10 milligrams of magnesium out through sweat. So you're mostly losing salt, sodium and chloride through sweat, which is why most people, when they're dehydrated in the hospital, get normal saline, which is 0.9%, whereas you may have only gotten half normal saline, which is 0.45%. It's really hard to say. But that, if you only get half normal saline and not full normal saline, and you are blood volume depleted, then that's not going to do really much. You're not going to feel very well on that type of solution. It's not high enough in salt.
Okay. That might have been the issue then. I was always thinking that it was just a lot of extracellular water because I always felt really puffy and gross and disgusting after having an IV. I was like, I don't think I want to do this anymore. But I mean, when we're talking about an athlete losing 10 pounds or more, prior to, and then maybe just not being able to put everything back in the body so quickly, I don't think that the cells hydrate themselves always very rapidly, like things like your brain. We talk about that a lot as athletes, like how it's easier to get knocked out when you are dehydrated or if the fluids haven't been put back into the place, which can be hard to do in 24 hours or less. At least that's what my impression is. What do you think on that?
Yeah, I think actually preferably if it's not like a very dire situation, it's better to ingest salt and electrolytes orally versus IV because IV is going just directly into the bloodstream. But we also have the interstitial fluid, which is 3 times the amount of your blood volume. And that's the reservoir that will actually pull to try to maintain blood volume, and that we also lose a lot of volume from the interstitial fluid through sweat. So if you're just dumping volume into the blood via IV, it's not probably as effective as orally ingesting it, which is going to both increase the blood volume, but also the interstitial fluid volume as well, which is all the fluid surrounding your tissues. So yes, and also if you're getting too much at once, it can be a little bit hard on the kidneys as well, because all of a sudden you're having this huge increase in blood volume, and now your kidneys are you're having to kind of, you're overstressing the system in a way potentially too. So yes, you do have to be careful with how much you're kind of infusing into someone.
So, what about the kidneys then? Are they really good at getting rid of too much salt?
The kidneys are, in a normal healthy person, studies have given up to 100 grams of salt per day, and it did not significantly increase blood pressure, because the kidneys are filtering over 3 pounds of salt every single day. They're filtering a full teaspoon of salt every 5 minutes. So actually, the main function of the kidneys is to reabsorb all the salt that they're filtering out every second. So it's an extremely highly advanced salt conserving machine. It's its primary mechanism. As we age, the kidney tubules lose their ability to reabsorb all the salt that's been filtered, and you start spilling salt out, which is why a lot of elderly people actually have a lot of falls, is because they are losing a lot of salt, and they can be hyponatremic in many instances, which increases the risk of falling and fractures and things like that. So yeah, a healthy normal kidney is very set up to handle a lot of salt.
So, that brings me to a point. My great uncle was having issues with his, I think vestibular system would be the right thing, right? That balance. And I said, Uncle, I'm going to send you some electrolytes, and I just want you to have a glass of these electrolytes in the morning. Was that a good decision on my part?
Yeah, well, I think from it, well, I guess it depends on the situation, but I mean, did it improve his sort
Yes.
of, his gait? Yeah, alter gait. Yeah, a lot of people are deficient in electrolytes, and basically it causes a lack of blood circulation to the brain. And so you can feel really dizzy if your blood volume is low, if you don't get enough salt. So boosting someone's salt status will increase their blood volume, improve blood circulation, and especially improve blood flow to the brain, which can help with people who are feeling dizzy, especially going from like a seated to a standing position.
That makes a lot of sense. And it makes me want to ask the question too, if you are aging and your kidneys are getting worse at the reuptake of sodium, would it make logical sense then that you just want to ingest a little bit more sodium at that point?
Yeah, so if you are, and here's what happens too, though, but a lot of people over retain water actually as their kidney function goes down. So you start losing salt, you start over retaining water. So you kind of start getting puffy, and, you see this edema that can happen, and people blame it on the salt, but they check their sodium levels and they're actually really low. And a lot of times it's the kidneys basically over retaining water. That's the problem, and not necessarily the salt. But some people do have kidney disease that leads to over retention of salt too. So it is important to work with your nephrologist to actually test and see what's called the fractional excretion of sodium and a 24-hour urinary sodium, just to kind of see, are the kidneys pushing out too much salt and losing a lot of salt, or are they actually over retaining?
Okay. Well, on the over retaining, let's switch to overeating. Why
Mhm.
is it that people would want to over consume calories when they don't consume enough sodium for the body?
So most studies across many different populations show that the average sodium intake is somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 milligrams of sodium, which is about like 1 1/3 teaspoon to 2 teaspoons of salt per day. So your body is driving you to consume that amount, because that's what the body views as optimal. It gives optimal blood volume status. It prevents from dehydration. It improves all the hormonal functions. It's the least stressful state of the body. So your body's going to drive you to consume that much. If you are consuming low salt foods, then you're going to have to eat more of those foods to obtain the salt that your body demands. And so from that perspective, if you are constantly just trying to eat low salt chips, or just take salt out of the diet completely, you are going to start increasing your cravings for overall food to obtain the salt that your body demands. And then secondarily, when you don't get enough salt, your body has a defense mechanism to make sure that you obtain enough of it. Because if you don't get enough salt, you can die. And so, because it's an essential nutrient. So the body will activate the reward center in the brain, the dopamine reward center in the brain. And so it's hyperactivated, and that increases sugar cravings as well. So you get increased sugar cravings when you don't get enough salt, And you actually get a greater dopamine response to things like sugar when you aren't getting enough salt. So a lot of people, which helps with their sugar cravings, is they'll just take a pinch of salt on their tongue, or they'll drink some pickle juice, or salt and electrolytes, and all of a sudden their sugar craving goes away. And they don't understand why. Well, you've just decreased the dopamine hyperactivation reward center in the brain by doing so.
Oh, that's a really helpful tidbit. I think people are going to be very excited to know that. People are always looking for ways to curb the appetite. And just anecdotally, my experience is when I'm eating something sweet, I don't have as a distinct of a that's enough as I do when I'm eating something that's very salty, which I
Yes.
love salty foods. I like those little egg white curls, the little lesser evil, which are very salty. And I'll have like a clear, like, I don't want any more. And I feel like my body clearly tells me when the salt is getting to be just too much, where things that are sweet, as long as they're not overly sweet, are much easier for me to over consume and not have like a clear shut off point, like just kind of want to like keep eating it or keep snacking on it. But anyways, I'm really glad to know that putting a little salt in the tongue, because there's a lot of times when, I have to diet and it's not the funnest thing in the world. You get a little, hankering for something sweet. So it's nice to know that maybe the shut off is just, throw something a little salty, a little savory in the mix, and hopefully that'll kind of help your body regulate the cravings that it's having.
Right. And there's a difference between salt, which is an essential nutrient, and, sugar. And so if you get too much salt, like you were saying, the taste receptors will flip and you'll get an aversion signal where, well, like when you start consuming too much salt, your body's like, wait a second, this is way too salty now. Whereas if you consume sugar, it's kind of like a positive feedback mechanism. You actually start craving more of it. So salt has that negative feedback system where once you get enough, it negatively feedbacks and tells the body, okay, I've had enough. Sugar is a feed forward system where the more sugar you consume, now your taste receptors in your brain are now kind of sort of primed to consume more and more and more. And so that's where a lot of people do overeat. They're overeating because of the sugar cravings and over consuming refined carbs and sugar. Nobody's really overeating apples or steak or real food. It's really the highly palatable foods that are being overconsumed.
So I've been diagnosed with hypothyroidism, and I've heard you talk a little bit about the thyroid and salt, but I do not have a clear understanding or depiction of how salt could potentially affect the thyroid. And as we're talking about cravings and these and that, sometimes I think with hypothyroidism, at least for me, your body just goes into a default mode. And I feel like I just want the quick energy, right? So I'm definitely somebody who will lean towards sweets especially if I'm not maybe able to exercise as vigorously as I want to, or if I'm not eating enough protein. There are a lot of things that can help me stay away from sugar. But at the same time, when you're tired or you feel lethargic, sometimes your body just wants the sweets. So what's up with the thyroid and salt, and how does that correlation work together?
Sodium is required to drive iodine actually into the thyroid gland so that you can even synthesize thyroid hormones. And then thyroid hormones are composed and made up of iodine. And so iodine can be found in certain salts as well. So in order to drive the iodine into the thyroid gland, you need sodium. And then also iodine can come from salt, which literally makes up our thyroid hormones itself. And thyroid hormones help the body at the kidney level retain salt. So people who are low thyroid typically end up spilling more salt out in the urine because they don't have the good functioning thyroid hormones to actually help the kidneys retain the salt that their body needs.
Okay, that's very, very important information. I'm so glad to learn that today. I'm actually doing a little experiment with myself to see if I can fix my thyroid with the right nutritional tools and working out. So I was on thyroid medication for quite a long time. And as of December, I have completely stopped taking it. Now, I did gain some weight. Part of that is just due to, the vigorous workouts aren't quite as much. It's when I'm in a camp, it's every day, twice a day kind of a thing, and now it's like once a day, once every other day, and then I'm also trying to consume more iodine naturally, like seaweed. Have a lot of good salt in my diet, these kinds of things, and I'm gonna get a blood test actually this week. Perhaps after I get off of this Zoom with you, I might go and get the blood drawn just to see where my thyroid is and if I can fix it with the right nutritional changes.
Yeah, and there's of course many causes of low thyroid, right? But for an athlete, you lose 50 to 100 micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise through sweat. So if you are constantly sweating and depleting your iodine status and then never, replacing that, that can lead to hypothyroidism. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case, but it's definitely possible if someone is losing a lot of iodine through sweat and they're not getting enough through diet, that it can deplete their iodine levels and lead to hypothyroidism. And of course, there's many different things that can affect the thyroid. Not getting enough carbohydrates can cause low thyroid potentially in certain people, and there's a plethora of other things as well. But yes, minerals do play a very important role, especially salt and iodine, when it comes to thyroid health.
Okay. Well, I'm on it, and I'll let you know the results because I've really been working diligently to try to, heal myself with the tools that I have as opposed to medications, if at all possible. So I've done the medication route. It was working for me, but now I'm on a mission to try to help heal myself. So speaking of which, people with high blood pressure, why, you touched on it at the beginning of this podcast. But I really want to dive into that a little bit with you because you were talking about, was it Doyle? Who was
Lewis Dahl. Yep.
Dahl, who bred these mice who were specifically salt resistant to get the result that he wanted. And then the whole system's kind of been based off of something that really wasn't backed by scientific, accurate scientific data. So a lot of people think that I have high blood pressure, I've got to reduce my sodium. I hear it all the time. I hear it given as medical advice. Why may we want to rethink that? And how does salt actually affect blood pressure in otherwise normal, healthy people?
Yeah. So 80% of people with normal blood pressure are not salt sensitive. And even the people that are salt sensitive, the majority of the time it's due to several factors, mostly insulin resistance from over consuming refined carbohydrates and sugar. The other main factor that causes salt sensitive high blood pressure is not getting enough potassium and magnesium. But yet most doctors will tell people to just cut out the salt because that's what they've been trained. But in fact, that's not even treating the root cause. Additionally, salt is an essential mineral. So to just be on a low level to try to keep the blood volume down and dehydrate someone to lower blood pressure, that's not really effective. I mean, the blood pressure lowering effect in most cases is actually harmful because you are just volume depleting the person and you are basically just dehydrating them. So I can tell people to just, stop drinking water and to lower their blood pressure, but that's not a good thing because you're just, again, dehydrating that person. So for the majority of people, it's not a good thing to be on a low salt diet. So fix the root cause. And we know that actually the majority of salt sensitive high blood pressure is due to insulin resistance because there are clinical studies where in people who have salt sensitive high blood pressure, you give them an insulin sensitizing medication called metformin, their salt sensitivity goes away. Or people who are overweight and salt sensitive, you have them lose weight and they're no longer salt sensitive. And typically when you lose weight, you improve your insulin sensitivity. So a lot of this has to do with people with too high insulin levels, causing them to over retain salt in water and not actually salt itself. So basically don't blame, the salt for what the sugar did. It is something I kind of like to say a lot.
I think that's more than fair. What exactly does salt sensitive mean though? What does a salt sensitive mice do? What do they do that a regular mouse doesn't do? What does a salt sensitive person do that a non-salt sensitive person do?
Yeah, basically, if you go from a normal salt diet to a low salt diet and your blood pressure drops by about 5% or greater, you're considered salt sensitive. That's kind of the standard definition.
And how do you test for that? I mean, how would somebody wouldn't know that unless they went and got a test for it, correct?
Right. Someone would have to start off with consuming, let's say, 1.5 teaspoons of salt every day for about a week, test their blood pressure every single day, and then they would have to go on a low salt diet, typically less than 2,300 milligrams, and see if their blood pressure drops by 5% or more. And then you're considered salt sensitive. But again, in the majority of people, that drop in blood pressure is more harmful than helpful. Not from just the fact that you are volume depleting that person in most instances, but also when you cut your salt intake, the kidneys are going to want to hold on to that salt. So you become insulin resistant. Your insulin levels will elevate to hold on to the salt. So now you're going to store more fat per calorie consumed on a low salt diet. So insulin levels go up on a low salt diet, and that is not good for weight loss, not good for visceral adiposity as well. And so, I mean, salt is kind of like the antidote, I think, for sugar, because sugar is kind of driving a lot of this obesity, and salt can actually help by reducing the food cravings that we talked about, reducing overall food intake, et cetera, improving insulin resistance, things like that.
When we talk about insulin, is it easy to compare insulin in layman's terms to sort of a storage hormone? Would that be like an accurate way to describe insulin?
Yeah, I think so. It helps basically bring fat and glucose into the cell, so your body can utilize it. But when you become resistant to those effects, insulin has to keep going higher and higher and higher, which can be a problem.
And we're seeing people who are thinner now having more insulin resistance issues. Do you think that is from an overconsumption of processed foods in general, or an underconsumption of the right salt and minerals? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's called thin on the outside, fat on the inside. These people are storing a lot of their fat in and around their organs. A lot of it has to do with over-consuming sugar. Myself and a few colleagues published a paper back in 2018 on how fructose basically increases inflammation, causes the body to increase cortisol, and that leads to more visceral fat accumulation. So you're not really seeing it on the outside. The fat isn't really being stored in the subcutaneous fat. It's being stored in and around the organs. And so it's really refined sugars, high fructose corn syrup, that they're dumping into everything, even table sugar being dumped into everything, that drives a lot of that thin on the outside, fat on the inside type of effect.
That's very concerning. I mean, because people aren't even able to necessarily know from the outside that they are having these health ailments. I know of a fighter, I won't mention him by name, but who we have the DEXA scan at the UFC Performance Institute too, that helps us determine exactly how much of our body fat or weight, the entire body is distributing its weight, whether it's bone mass, fat, hydration, your visceral fat, your the fat on the more on the outside of the body. So I'm using a lot of layman's terms here, but athletes who have cut weight, I'm assuming incorrectly, or even just for so much of their life, and do a lot of yo-yo dieting, which is like, they're basically going back and forth from eating super clean or really depriving the body, and then all of a sudden, going off the charts and eating candy and cake and, putting everything back in the body in the wrong way, have a lot of visceral fat as well. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you are giving signals to the body that it can potentially go into this very, very low calorie state at any moment, it's going to want to then hold on to all those calories because it keeps seeing this threat that continues to happen to it. And so it doesn't want to die of starvation. So you keep in an athlete that's, let's say, not eating for a whole week, and then they just gorge themselves. You're kind of telling your body you're going from famine to feast a lot, and it doesn't know when this cycle is ever going to end. And so that can absolutely lead to basically a breakdown in adaptive thermogenesis. That's what actually happens is when a lot of people who cut their calorie intake, their metabolism then goes down. And so you then reintroduce the calories and their metabolism isn't back up to where it was. So now you start storing more fat per calorie consumed, compared to when you had previously, before you previously actually started cutting calories. So you are messing your body's metabolism up. It's called adaptive thermogenesis. A lot of people will simply call this starvation mode, but it's called adaptive thermogenesis, where if you cut calories, metabolism goes down, and that's your body's way of trying to prevent it from dying. Because why would the body keep the metabolism the same when calories are really low? So a lot of these people that are going on extreme diets also tend to overeat afterwards, right? Like you go to the buffet and then generally over consume, and now, but you're still in that state of lowered metabolic rate. So now a lot of those calories are going to be stored as fat in and around the organs. So that's probably what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is why crash diets don't work. People, it doesn't work. If you give the body what it needs, the body will give you what it needs. I have a very robust metabolism now. I eat very well. People think that in order to be lean and fit, that they've got to deprive. And I really am, I want to be the example of the exact opposite of that. That we need to have salt, we need to have enough calories, we need to give our body a lot of tools to be successful. Because if we want to be healthy, then we have to provide our body with the right balance of everything that it needs.
I couldn't have said that better myself.
Yeah. Thank you. Why do you think it is that there is still a stigma around salt? I feel like people are starting to learn, but there's still a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of, ooh, salt is bad. I mean, one of my friends, I was like, oh, you're drinking this water, and I was looking at the bottle, and I was like, oh, that's nice. There's a little bit of salt in this, a little bit of electrolytes, just a tiny, tiny bit. She's like, oh no, like I can't have that. And it's just, it amazes me because these are professional athletes. There's still many professional athletes, and especially when we were talking about weight, but even just people on a daily basis think that salt is harmful and something that should be avoided. So where is this messaging coming from? Why is the science and research not more readily available, and the change happening to where the guidelines of the overarching thought here and delivery of information is not available to the masses?
Yeah, well, most of it is coming from people's doctors, which if their doctor tells them, hey, salt is going to kill you, salt is going to give you high blood pressure, they're going to believe that. And so there is this widespread fear among the general population, primarily from the doctors, that salt is bad. And it's not really the doctor's fault. They're not really taught nutrition. And what they are taught is they're taught that salt is bad. But the thing is because we've been recommending it for 50 to 70 years before there was any, even group that could even do meta-analyses to look at actually the clinical studies, it's just been ingrained in everyone's minds for decades. So that's why even a lot of people's, grandparents think that salt is bad for them, because it's been so long that we've heard the same drumming of low salt, we need to be on low salt, etc. There's no good studies though. There's not a single metabolic ward study where they gave the same diets with the only difference being salt, showing that salt increases hypertension, increases cardiovascular events, or all-cause mortality. We literally need those studies, but they just don't exist, because really all of nutrition research is pretty bad unless it's a metabolic ward study, and not many people even do those studies. So a lot of the recommendations of low salt, et cetera, is just based on expert opinion from, like I said, about over 50 years ago.
How much does an MD need to have in schooling as far as nutrition goes? Like, how much focus of school actually goes to understanding how these nutrients work in the body?
Most doctors get 4 hours of nutrition research. That's it. They are there to be very good at diagnosing situations, right? Like, what is this rash, et cetera, and figuring out, certain disease states, or what's going on, or how to treat someone acutely. That's what they're doing. They're surgeons, or they're in the cardiac CCU, and they're helping people who've just had a heart attack. They are not trained in nutrition. I mean, I've been publishing on nutrition for over a decade. I have over 300 papers. Like my job for over 10 years at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute was literally to just research and publish. Um, and so if that's not your like actual job and you're not doing that on a consistent basis, uh, where are you really getting your information from if you're only getting 4 hours of nutritional education in school? So you can't really blame the doctors. They're not really taught these things.
No, I think there are a lot of really well-meaning doctors. I imagine most doctors go into that field because they genuinely want to help people. But there's something broken in the education system, I believe, if you are aspiring to be a doctor that helps people heal their body, but you are taught in a way that really only diagnoses symptoms and then how to fix the symptom and not necessarily the root cause. Is that part of the reason why you went the direction that you went? And why did you? Why do you want to get the right information out there? Why don't you just fit the mold of so many other doctors that have been taught by the traditional system? Like, how did you go about wanting to facilitate and make change in the other direction?
Yeah, I originally started publishing on medications. And I saw that with my patients, you can only go so far with medications. And so that's really, I took a turn where I need to figure out nutrition better, not just for their health, but also my health. I wanted to improve my own health as well. And so that's when I started kind of taking the nutritional approach and looking more into the research on that, because ultimately, it's what you put in your body, what you're feeding yourself on a day-to-day basis, that's going to be the biggest driver to your overall health.
So, what does a typical day for you look like as far as nutrition goes?
Yeah, so for breakfast, usually I have 3 pasture-raised eggs, and I'll have some type of grass-fed meat. Maybe it might be grass-fed steak. Maybe it's a little bit of organic grass-fed bacon. Um, and then I'll also have about 4 ounces of grass-fed milk for the calcium, and then also basically like a organic peach or nectarine. So that's breakfast. Lunch will be usually another, let's say, 5 ounces of meat, fruit, maybe more grass-fed dairy too. And then dinner is probably pretty similar. Like it's like I rotate which kind of meats. I rotate the fruits. Usually it's like either organic nectarines, peaches, or berries. And then, usually I try to add in some dairy for grass-fed dairy for the calcium, because it's very difficult to get calcium if you're not consuming dairy. The only other way I know how to get calcium, bioavailable calcium, would be to like really clean off the eggshells and grind them up and consume that as a powder. Or if you take a supplement, but I prefer to get it from food. So I would probably consume about 8 ounces of grass-fed milk a day to try to, increase the calcium intake, which is really important for athletes, bones and et cetera, bone health. That's important.
And are you salting your foods? Are you consuming salt first thing in the morning, right before you go to bed? I mean, what are you doing as far as salt goes?
Yeah, as soon as I wake up, I always have 1 scoop of relight in about 10 ounces of water. So that gives me about a third of a teaspoon of salt. And then, yep, I just salt my food to taste. So salt goes on the eggs, goes on the meats. If I do have some potatoes too, I do have consume some organic potatoes as well for the carbs. Salt goes on those bad boys too.
And how much do you work out if I'm not prying too much in your personal life?
No, yeah, I lift weights about 3 to 4 times a week, and I run about a mile and a half, about 4 times a week as well. And I play basketball probably 3, 4 times a week for about 30 minutes. So yeah, I'm fairly active.
Did you have a point where you were having any health ailments that improved for change in diet, or when you started to become aware of this, did you have any reason why something was not going right and you said, "Hey, I think I want to go about this a different way"?
Yeah, so I did. I tore my pectoralis tendon bench pressing when I was 26. So that's why I became very interested in collagen, in collagen health, because collagen is, makes up your tendons and your ligaments. And I was probably getting none. And, prior to, I was 26, so that was over 10 years ago. I was just starting to get into my research at that point. Um, and also coffee. I was way over because I was writing so many publications and books, I was drinking 9 cups of coffee a day for like, I don't know, for years. So I way overconsume coffee, and it caused probably a lot of reflux. And once I'm actually completely off coffee. I don't think everyone needs to be off coffee, but it's a slippery slope for me. If I have 1 cup of coffee, I'm going to want 2, I'm going to want 3, I'm going to want 4. So I just cut it out about a year and a half ago. But I was way over consuming it. I think a lot of people can do just fine on 1 or 2 cups, but I was getting a lot of reflux from it. And once I cut out the coffee, my reflux improved dramatically.
Oh, it's so interesting. You are such a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so grateful for our conversation today. I know I learned a lot, and I think the listeners are really going to appreciate the science-backed evidence and research when it comes to hydration, electrolytes, salt, the correlation and the difference, but how everything works together. You've really enlightened a lot of us, I think, today. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate having you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was fun.